Hi, good evening. It's Thinking Slow. Wanted to do a quick video about the Netherlands because they just announced a sort of soft lockdown beginning on the 12th of November 2021. And the reason we wanted to do this video is because we've done other material about the Netherlands last year where we warned that the country can be locked down at the drop of a hat, basically, because the data they used last year really didn't have any substance to it. It's again very heavily driven by cases, which are very heavily driven by testing, and we'll show a pretty interesting chart that just shows they ramp up to double levels of testing just before they make an announcement on restrictions and withdrawing liberties. And that's been a very regular pattern, and actually putting this together, you can see it's so obvious what they're doing time and time again, basically. And they've done it again just now. They've just doubled testing levels for a few days before making this announcement of new restrictions. And we'll go into why there's no justification for that, basically, let alone the fact that they lied, as they did in other countries, about vaccination being a way out of restrictions. So the people have complied, they've been vaccinated, but you're back in restrictions again. And the main theme of this presentation is fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. And at some point, hopefully people in the Netherlands have to recognize the pattern of dishonest ramping up of testing and then using those case numbers to impose restrictions on people's liberties. It's a clear pattern, and at some point people have to get fed up with it and say this is unreasonable, it doesn't make any scientific sense, and it's well beyond the role of the government to start locking people down and imposing this kind of tyranny. So this is something we wrote last year. Basically, as I said at the end, our final conclusion was if you allow the government to do these things really without any hard evidence, they can lock you down at any time at all. And that was our big conclusion. And then seeing this announcement from the 12th of November 2021, it's an absolute repeat. There really is no justification. I mean, firstly, it's a policy that doesn't really work. And then even the data that they show, I'll show you, is all based on cases which mean very little. There's no real hard data that could possibly justify this decision at the moment. So let's go through cases, deaths, hospitalisation, and then come to a conclusion what these policies really are all about, because they're not about preventing the spread of a disease and they're not about your health. So I just put this together today, but this is an overlay of the number of tests, which is the blue line, and the orange dotted line is the number of positive tests. So immediately you can see how closely lined up these things are. And then probably what's more surprising for me, actually, in a way, is the obvious ramp up of testing. So these blue lines are sort of doubling, tripling, right up to announcements of restrictions in these little circles. So I just went through a timeline of when the restrictions were, and these points line up perfectly. So the first, after the first lockdown, the sort of next major restrictions coming into winter 2020, the first one was 14th of October. There was a partial lockdown. I mean, look at that. It's exactly at the peak of testing. I mean, it couldn't be any more obvious what they're doing, basically. Then, they get their decision done, the testing backs off, and then they ramp it up again. We're looking almost tripling now, 2.5 times to get up to this level. And then this is the hard lockdown they announced on the 15th of December. Again, the announcement lines up 100% with this peak in testing that drives the peak in cases. So, I think even on these two data points, the pattern is obvious. And then there's another similar situation where they released a lot of restrictions sometime in June, And then they ramped up very quickly the testing again into 10th of July, which is here, not quite exactly at the peak, but very close. And then they reimposed those restrictions. Again, I mean, just look at this. It seems so obvious. Hopefully everyone sees how these things are essentially stage managed to get to these points. And this is quite common in a number of other countries. We've seen this as well. So this is now the latest restrictions. These testing and case figures, they're weekly, so they're slightly delayed, but they've already doubled the level of testing basically, and I think they're now getting up to, I think it is about 10,000 cases a day. So they'll be pushing this number of tests up. So these things will end up about here somewhere on the day of the announcement. So this time series finishes a little bit before the 12th of November. But this is exactly the same story again. And actually in this case, it's even more severe, because you'll see the numbers on real world indicators like deaths, ICU occupancy and hospital occupancy are going nowhere. So this case is even more astounding than the other ones, because there really is no real world data to support any kind of locking down of the Netherlands. So this is deaths, and this picture here is the one you'll see if you open the Dutch dashboard. It looks pretty sort of peaking up in towards the end of October 2021. But actually there's another tab in here which lets you take a longer time frame, and then a lot of what the politicians are doing are not giving any perspective on anything basically. So the shorter the time frame, the easier it is for them to create a sense of panic and urgency and to justify draconian policies. But as soon as you start stretching numbers out onto any kind of timeline, and even this is very short, the longer you stretch this out in terms of total deaths, etc., more perspective you get, the more you realize these policies are really crazy. There's just no justification for any of this. But even on this time frame, which is roughly a year and a half, you can see these are the death numbers now. I think somewhere about 20 a day, which is well below where they were a year ago, and a tiny fraction of where they were really when there was a serious peak in deaths during the first wave. So on this perspective, you can see, if you saw this chart on its own, there was no way you would ever say, okay, let's pull the trigger and send 17.4 million people into lockdown based on what's going on in this little circle. You can see it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, as a sort of slightly related but a side issue actually to deaths is there are excess deaths in Holland, but I think you can see just from these two numbers that they're not COVID deaths. So this is again official government data. During this period, there were 3,365 deaths, of which COVID was 145 deaths. So it's less than 5%. So, again, providing context, COVID is not the biggest issue in the Netherlands. You got 95% of deaths have got nothing whatsoever to do with COVID. That's 3,150 roughly from 3,300. That's the scale of how significant non-COVID deaths are. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this, but you can see there are excess deaths during this period. There's about 550 of those, and 3/4 of them are nothing to do with COVID. Now, I'm not going to go into what they were to do with, but we've done quite a bit of work on these non-COVID excess deaths. But again, the message here is COVID is not the problem. You can see that here. It's not big numbers in absolute terms, and then relative to total deaths in this period, it's less than 5%. So, again, there's no way that looking at those numbers, you're justifying locking up 17.4 million people. It's kind of a similar story for the number of people in hospital. This is the daily admissions Yeah, okay, they are high. It's a seasonal coronavirus, but again, in the grand scheme of things, they're no higher than a year ago and much lower than during the genuine first wave of this disease. And again, you've had a year and a half to look for solutions to this. If you need solutions, you've had a long time, and any solution you come up with is going to be better than locking up 17.4 million people, withdrawing their liberties, disrupting their businesses, so on and so forth. That is obviously the worst case outcome, particularly as it's completely pointless from a epidemiology point of view. So again, looking at this, there's no excuse for lockdown being even on the table as a possibility, to be honest. Not only are these levels not particularly high compared to a year ago, but there's multiple other solutions that could have been put in place in the last year and a half. A seasonal coronavirus behaving seasonally is not a surprise to anyone, and the lockdown is completely unjustified again on this basis. And this picture is even more striking. This is something that you won't find in the government information packs. This is ICU occupancy. This is from another source, but it's also official. This is again nowhere particularly. It's lower than it was a year ago. It's again way down on where it was on peak. And the idea that because you have 360 people in intensive care, it makes sense to lock down 17.4 million is completely crazy, obviously. And again, as in the previous chart, this seasonality is no surprise to anyone. And there's been, again, more than a year and a half in which to prepare for this eventuality. So anything could have been done to deal with this situation other than lockdown. Lockdown is the most destructive and senseless policy you could possibly have. So again, the same conclusion, that the absolute numbers show that any kind of lockdown isn't justified. And given the time period that's been available, any number of things could have been done to avoid lockdown. And as far as I can see, they haven't been done. They just again smash the emergency exit glass and push the whole country and 17.4 million people into a soft lockdown, completely unjustified. So the key thing about lockdown is it doesn't work. Okay, I could slightly qualify that by saying there could be some very small impacts, but the cost of those impacts is astronomical and not justified. And here's just a selection of some papers, all kinds of maths going through epidemiology curves in different countries showing that lockdown basically does not work. And that's where the science is. If you follow the science says it doesn't work. The only one piece of paper I've seen that says it does work is based on the logic that there was a lockdown and then cases fell at some point in thereafter, therefore it works, which is actually a false conclusion. So if you look at any of these, including from Professor Ioannidis and others, world experts in biostatistics, they conclude pretty clearly that lockdown doesn't work. So this is a policy that generates nothing or next to nothing, and the cost is astronomical. So even if you had the data, which you don't, this policy doesn't make any sense anyway. So it's a double insanity to be doing this, basically. So what really is going on in Holland? They're ramping up the test to create the high cases. They're avoiding discussing real-world numbers like deaths, ICU occupancy, or hospital occupancy, because those numbers don't justify any kind of panic or any kind of lockdown. They've falsely sold the promise of vaccination as a way out. So everyone, 80% roughly in Holland, have been vaccinated of the adult population, and here you are back in November 2021, back in lockdown. And as I said, there's been plenty of time. If there really genuinely is any pressure on hospitals, and there's no sign of that pressure in the ICU numbers, there's been 1.5 years to prepare for that, and seemingly nothing's been done. So really, what is going on? I think there's a number of things going on. One is, I think we've seen in different countries, just a power grab. There's no two ways about it. Another area is just pure incompetence, that there's a group of people that believe big government is the savior of the universe, and everything we do has to involve huge government intervention, although government intervention usually is a disaster. They believe in that as some kind of religious belief. Therefore, the heavy hand of government has to be used, who knows why, who knows for what, but there must be mass state intervention. So those are certainly things that go on, but there is an agenda. Obviously there's an agenda. It's written up in the book, The Great Reset. We keep referring to it because if you read it, it basically, all of the government's policies are all covered in that book. Basically, the whole Build Back Better agenda is essentially laid out. And this is probably one of the most important paragraphs in there, basically. The aim of the Great Reset is to achieve structural changes in consumption behavior. And nothing is going to do that as well as locking people in their houses and disrupting their lives. And it even goes specifically into what consumption behavior they're going to change: cars, flying, eating, this is the meat issue, heating the house, and so on and so forth. And they basically want those things. They want the things that we're being forced to do during the pandemic to translate into permanent changes. So, again, what does that mean? If this is a policy objective, they want to keep locking you down, because then these patterns of behavior, they become permanent. And that's really the aim of this paragraph. At least it's telling you that's what they want, basically. And to make this structural, they have to keep locking you down over and over again until you get used to the idea that going out to a restaurant's a no-no, driving around is a no-no, consuming things is a no-no, going by transport to your office and back is a no-no. This is what they're doing. They're crushing the way of life that people are used to, and they're crushing any kind of consumption in a way that they've decided is reasonable. That's certainly an element of policy making is coming from this Great Reset, and there's many reasons why that is. I have reasonably good evidence to show the link between the Davos oligarchy and the policy making apparatus in different countries, especially in the UK. I'm guessing it's pretty well the same in Holland. And just closing up on that theme, there's an interesting exchange here with a Dutch parliamentarian who directly asked the Prime Minister about this Great Reset, who laughed the whole thing off. I don't know anything about this Great Reset. This is maybe a conspiracy theory that you've been reading into. And the Dutch parliamentarian Gideon basically said, well, it's surprising that you don't know anything about this, because you actually wrote to Klaus Schwab thanking him for the book, and going on to say that building back better is an important policy objective. And although the Prime Minister was completely skewered and exposed, telling a direct and blatant lie, for him it seemed to make no difference. He just laughed it off, as is quite common for modern day politicians. But the Dutch parliamentarian exposed directly that the Prime Minister had, well, at least he had said he'd read the book, he'd written to Schwab. So the idea he has no idea about this Great Reset is a complete lie. And actually his letter confirms, yes, building back better is very important. And then he throws in all of those vague globalist terms that don't really mean, they mean what they want them to mean. They don't really mean anything. Sustainability, equity, inclusivity, circularity, all of that language is in there, but you don't really know what that really stands for, and what it means for the average person. But anyway, this is an interesting exchange that you can look up on YouTube. I found it amazing. I found the Prime Minister's reaction amazing, that he just, okay, so I was lying, whatever. No sort of, no red face, no nothing. So he certainly knows about the Great Reset. He said he's read the book and he's written to Schwab. So, just finishing off here, I mean, I think many people understand that the social contract between the government and the people has basically been ripped up, and the government has taken on a role that it was never assigned to government. Government never was created anywhere in the world in order to micromanage everybody's life, and to decide what you can eat, when you can eat it. You can have meat, you can't have meat. You can't go on a foreign holiday, you can't travel here, you can't do this, you can't heat your home with a gas boiler. This is not the role of government, and this is the role they've taken on, and they're using COVID as a mechanism for imposing this tyranny. And I very much hope that just exposing some of those numbers, for any colleagues watching this in Holland, I hope you understand the pattern and the tricks of ramping up the testing just before they make a lockdown announcement. And those case numbers then, especially this time round, basically are not reflected in any real world indicators on deaths, ICU occupancy, or hospitals. So, this is what they're doing in order to impose other policy objectives on you. And no government has the right, in my book, to do that. I've never seen any kind of constitutional arrangements that contemplate government micromanaging citizens' lives. This is a new thing they've decided for themselves. And I certainly very much believe in this phrase, when tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. And going on different marches, you see a lot of people who have never in their lives been involved in marches or politics or anything else, but they realize, now is the time to stand up, because what's going on is not just, and it needs to be opposed. So hopefully a few of these numbers will help people understand and help build some commitment to more opposition to what's going on, because I think it does need to be opposed. And as we say at the end of every show, don't stay safe, but stay free. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.